I was 20 years old when I made the decision to leave home and start fresh. University was just around the corner, and I wanted to change something different, something new. That's how I ended up moving in with my uncle, Daniel Hayes, and his wife, Sarah Mitchell. They lived in a quiet town not too far from the city where I would be studying architecture. At first, I thought this transition would be easy. I assumed it would feel just like high school, except with a little more independence. But as soon as I settled in, I realized how different everything felt. There was something about living with Daniel and Sarah that I hadn't expected. Their home was warm and welcoming, a place filled with laughter and peace. Unlike the rest of my family, Uncle Daniel was exceptionally Kindleways polite, always composed. No matter what happened, he remained calm, his voice steady, his presence reassuring. Sarah, on the other hand, had an energetic personality, always moving, always speaking her mind. They were opposites in many ways, yet their relationship worked so effortlessly. I liked living with them. Their routines, their way of life, it all made me feel at ease. But as time went on, I started noticing little things that made me question the way I felt. Daniel's constant composure, the way he spoke with such thoughtfulness, his calm and steady demeanour, it made me feel different. I didn't understand why, and I told myself I would get used to it. For the first 3 months, life in their home remained predictable. I focused on my studies, adjusted to my new environment, and enjoyed the stability of it all. Everything felt normal. Until that night. It had been a long day. I had spent most of it at the library, trying to stay ahead in my coursework. By the time I got home, the sun had set, and the house was quiet. I walked through the front door, still lost in my thoughts, when I heard Sarah's cheerful voice from the living room. "You look great, Lily," she said, flashing a bright smile as she glanced up from her seat. I hadn't thought much about what I was wearing, just a simple dress, something I had thrown on without a second thought. But when Daniel's eyes flickered up from his plate, just for a brief moment, something about his gaze made me pause. It wasn't anything strange, just a quick, natural glance. And yet, for reasons I couldn't explain, it made my heart beat a little faster. He returned to his meal as if nothing had happened, his expression unreadable, his manner as composed as ever. I shook off the feeling and joined them at the table, pushing the thought aside. Throughout dinner, Daniel and Sarah talked as usual. They laughed, shared stories, and filled the room with their easy conversation. A couple of times, Daniel started to say something to me but stopped himself, as if reconsidering his words. It was nothing out of the ordinary, yet I felt strangely aware of every moment. By the time I went to bed, I was restless. My thoughts wouldn't settle, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, my mind kept drifting back to Daniele's presence, his voice, the way he carried himself. It was frustrating. This feeling I couldn't put into words. I tried to push it away, but it lingered, following me into my dreams. The next morning, I woke to the soft glow of sunlight streaming through my window. The air was crisp, carrying the quiet of a Sunday morning. I stretched, trying to shake off the strange weight in my chest from the night before. After a quick shower, I dressed in a t-shirt and shorts, feeling refreshed. Sarah usually went out early on weekends to run errands, so breakfast was always just me and Daniel. It had become a routine, something comfortable and familiar, but that morning something was different. As I stepped into the kitchen, I found Daniel sitting alone at the table, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. When he saw me, he offered a small smile. "Good morning, Lily." His voice was a little softer than usual, though I couldn't tell why. "Morning, Uncle Daniel," I replied, grabbing a cup of coffee. There was a brief silence before he spoke again. Sarah got some bad news this morning, he said, his voice calm but thoughtful. Her friend's mother passed away. She had to leave early to be with her family in another state. I hesitated. Oh, that's awful. Is she okay? She's upset, of course, but she'll be gone for at least a day, he explained, slowly tapping his fork against his plate. Something about the way he said it made me pause. His tone was neutral, but it carried something else beneath the surface, something I couldn't quite identify. I see, I said, forcing a small smile. Looks like it's just us today. He met my gaze briefly, then nodded. Looks like it. The quietness of the morning settled around us, filling the space between our words. It should have been just another ordinary breakfast, but for some reason I felt a strange tension in the air. I sat down across from him, my heart beating just a little faster than usual. At first, I kept my distance, but as the minutes passed, I found myself leaning in slightly, closing the space between us. I wasn't sure why. I told myself it was nothing. Just another normal morning. Just another quiet breakfast. And yet, I could feel it something shifting, something changing. That was the moment I realized things would never quite be the same. For the first time, I truly acknowledged the thoughts lingering at the edge of my mind, the ones I had been ignoring, dismissing as nothing. But they weren't nothing. They were real. And I didn't know what to do with them. The rest of the morning passed in quiet stillness. Daniel and I went about our usual routine, reading the newspaper, me scrolling through my notes for an upcoming project. But despite how normal everything looked, something in the air felt different. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that nothing had changed. But as the day went on, I became more and more aware of Daniel's presence, the way he carried himself, the calm steadiness in his voice, the subtle glances he cast my way, and, most of all, the way I reacted to it. I had never felt this way before. Not about him, not about anyone. And yet, here I was, drawn in by something I couldn't explain. By the time afternoon arrived, I knew I had to get out of the house for a bit. I think I'll go for a walk, I announced, grabbing my jacket. Daniel looked up from his book, his expression unreadable for a moment before he nodded. That sounds like a good idea. It's a nice day out. I didn't stay out long. Just a short walk through the neighbourhood, hoping that fresh air would clear my mind. But when I returned, the feeling hadn't faded. If anything, it had only grown stronger. That evening, the house was quiet. Sarah was still gone, and there was something almost unsettling about how still everything felt. I sat on the couch with a book in my hands, trying to focus on the words, but my mind kept drifting. Across the room, Daniel sat in his usual chair, a cup of coffee resting on the table beside him. At some point, I glanced up and found his eyes on me. He wasn't staring, just looking, but the moment our gazes met, something inside me shifted. I should have looked away. I should have said something to break the silence, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself holding on to that moment longer than I should have. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. I hesitated before answering. "Yeah, just thinking." He nodded, as if he understood, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I wasn't sure how it happened, but at some point, I moved closer. Maybe it was subconscious, or maybe it was something I had wanted to do all along. The space between us grew smaller, and suddenly I could feel the warmth of his presence next to me. I told myself to stop, to step back before things went too far, but I didn't. Instead, I whispered, I don't know what this is, but I know I feel something. His eyes searched mine, and for the first time I saw something in them that I hadn't noticed before, something hesitant yet undeniable. Lily. His voice was quiet, careful. This is complicated. I swallowed hard. I know. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, like the entire world had faded away, leaving only the two of us. Then, before I could say anything else, a sound broke through the silence, the front door opening. Sarah. I felt my entire body tense as I pulled away, my heart pounding. She stepped into the room, her expression calm but knowing. Her eyes flickered between Daniel and me, and I knew she had seen something. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice even but firm. I froze. I didn't know what to say. Nothing had happened, and yet everything had. Daniel was the first to speak. "Nothing, Sarah," he said, his voice measured. But she wasn't convinced. I could see it in her expression, the way she studied us carefully. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she sighed. "You two need to figure this out," she said simply. Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. "I don't know what's going on, but whatever it is, you need to be careful." With that, she turned and left the room, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. I didn't know what to do, what to say. I could still feel the weight of everything, the emotions I didn't understand, the pull I was too afraid to acknowledge. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Lily, I know what you're feeling, but we have to be careful. We have to think about this." I looked at him, my heart pounding. "I know, but what if I don't want to ignore it?" He hesitated, his expression torn. Sometimes feelings aren't enough. His words should have made things clearer, should have given me the answer I needed. But instead, they only left me with more questions. That night, as I lay in bed, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. We had crossed a line, maybe not in action, but in thought, and once that happened, there was no going back. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the storm inside me. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't over. Not yet.